Welcome to episode 234, Conceptualizing Intimacy Beyond Sex, the interplay of attachment, boundaries, and vulnerability, featuring Dr. Tamora Callands, licensed clinical psychologist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am so happy to be joined today by Dr. Tamora Callands. She has this really fascinating history. She's a licensed clinical psychologist, and prior to stepping into the mental health space, she was doing more of the health outcome side and the systems. And I'm just so interested to have her here today for a conversation about intimacy and the different considerations, because goodness knows that when we hear that word, we automatically think of certain things. And I'm grateful for Dr. Tamora for coming on to talk with us about what intimacy is and what it's not and what we need to know as clinicians. So again, for our listeners, Dr. Tamora Callands, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tamora.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. This is one of my favorite things to talk about.
So for our listeners who are not familiar with your work, will you take a moment to please introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I am actually an associate professor at the University of Georgia in the Department of Health Promotion and Behavior in the College of Public Health. So I've been working in public health for about 12 years now. And my main focus is on sexual and mental health, mainly among women. But I also do a little bit of HIV prevention work. And so how all this relates is this is all related to sexual and reproductive health. And so I think in order for us to be healthy mentally and sexually, we definitely need to understand who we are as humans. And so I feel like that's my job, at least on a research level.
How did you fall into that?
Short story?
Sure. Short story.
Okay, short story. I really honestly fell into it by fate, to be honest, because growing up, I grew up in an environment where there were a lot of people engaging in a lot of sexual risk behavior. And so I always wondered, like what made me different. And so I took a lot of time to kind of figure that out. And I was like, some way, somehow I'm going to work on, sexual health interventions for inner city youth. And that's where it kind of all started. And so then that morphed into me really wanting to understand more about sexual health and understanding more about reproductive health and then doing it internationally. And so that's how it all came together, and I still get to do it. And now my job, which I'm kind of moving into, is figuring out how to incorporate the research side with the teaching side and make my clinical side and make all those pieces come together. And that is, I'm still trying to figure it out, but I'm putting one foot in front of the other and making it happen.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us to talk about this. Prior to recording, Dr. Tamora had commented that when we hear the word intimacy, many of us think of one thing. What do we think of, Dr. Tamora, when we hear the word intimacy?
Sex. We automatically think of the most fun topic ever, sex. Or for some people, the most fun topic. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's not the case.
So why don't we start by first you defining what intimacy even is?
I would say, so this is the whole cliche, right? Intimacy is into me see. And I completely agree with that, right? So I think that intimacy is about cultivating and understanding what makes each other click and first starting to understand what that is in yourself. And so it's this idea of how you grow and understand who you are as a person, and then how you can show up as a partner, and really being able to understand the facets of yourself and other people around you to build connection and love and vulnerability and empathy and all the things that we want in long-lasting relationships.
Why do our brains go to intimacy equals sex?
I think our brains go there because of propaganda. And to be honest, like when people first think about, like you said, intimacy, it's something that has always been equated with sex. When we think about sexual socialization and what we're socialized to think about, it's either one of two things. When we start from young kids, either your parents don't talk about it, or when they do, it's always about the body parts and kind of sex itself. Very rarely do parents even embark upon the topics of, like, how do you even begin to cultivate a relationship? What makes you think that you like this young boy? Or what is it that you want to get out of a relationship? Those are the conversations that parents are not having with kids, and that ultimately, essentially, we're not even having with ourselves as adults, right? So I think as you mature and you start to understand yourself better, then you're able to have those types of conversations. But even, when we start out, it's never that. It's always, oh, I like him or her or whomever because of they're cute, or they're this or they're that, and not really the intricate details around what you all can bring together and or how you all can come together as a partner. And I think that that's really important, that people don't seem to talk about. And ultimately, it ends up in a lot of frustration and relationships not being what you want them to be.
Given your background and what you had shared in your short story, thank you, where you were seeing a lot of high risk sexual behaviors, knowing what you know now, how do you feel like this concept of intimacy crosses over? Like, what's the relationship between high risk sexual behavior and intimacy, or lack thereof?
Ultimately, it comes down to, in the beginning, once we embark upon these journeys, or we feel like we want to have sexual relationships with people, a lot of times we're young, we don't really understand who we are. And to be honest, women typically, those people who were socialized as women, grow up thinking that they owe something to the world, and that something is our bodies a lot of times, right? And so I cannot tell you how many countless experiences I've known of, had myself, or friends of mine have had, where they felt pressured to kind of become physically intimate with people before they have actually known any other aspect of them. And so I think that that's where that comes from. It's like this pressure to feel like, oh, it's a patriarchal thing. Like, men want something and women's job is to give it to them, just in general, right? And so we can extrapolate that out and think about how that works in terms of gender and gender roles and all this other stuff. But that's typically what people have been socialized to believe. So unfortunately, this is why, in my opinion, we have a lot of uh, sexual assault. We have a lot of, and those are people that we know, right? We know, like, I think it's like 70% or something ridiculously high number, where when we talk about sexual assault or sexual harassment, it's people that we know. And I think that's part of the patriarchy, right? That's part of what women expect of men and what men expect of women. And so I think if we take that piece of it, we think about, like I said, growing up as a young kid, it's like, well, to get this person's attention, this is what I need to do. Everyone else is doing. And there's so much of that going on right now, just to kind of fit in, and what expectations you have as a young person, and not really understanding your body and what you want before kind of giving it away. So I think that ultimately, if I go back and think about a lot of the friends and acquaintances I had, I think it was a self-worth issue. It's a self-worth issue. It's a socialization issue. It's what you're told you're supposed to do at such and such age to be accepted.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You made a good point about the way that we're socialized and that potential mismatch developmentally. That
Mm-hmm.
and speaking as someone who's socialized female, I can certainly relate with that, and I'm sure that our listeners can too. This idea that for many people that we're socialized female, our first currency is our body, our attractiveness, how we can serve somebody else with that body. And I remember seeing those messages very, very young, just at the grocery store, Cosmo magazine being the magazine or the example that I always call upon, where I was this little kid who was just learning to read. And I'm seeing all these messages, just, buying a stick of gum or a pack of gum saying, like, how to serve your man, or like whatever kind of heteronormative patriarchal messages I was getting, that's marinade.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure you didn't see How to Serve Your Woman.
No, I didn't. And that was, I think, a revelation for me the first time that I had that thought, and then started looking more at like, the quote unquote men's health magazines of like what the equivalents were. And you and I could probably spend many more than just one podcast episode kind of deconstructing where these norms come from. But they're very complex, and I think they go back to your original point, which is our difficulty understanding and having healthy intimacy, because it has been uh, altered because of the way that we talk about it socially, and that in ways that I think take away from the actual intimacy, like you said, that it's like, oh, let me give of my body and be with somebody physically, sexually, without commensurate intimacy elsewhere.
And it's so funny. I think like as a kid, I always thought, by kid I mean like early teenager, I would always tell my friends, I was just this weird child, so let's start there. But I would always tell my friends, like, are you ready for sex? Like, what about what happens emotionally after? You know? And so I think about that now, and I guess I was onto something then, right? Like something we never really talked about, and none of them were prepared for it and knew what I was talking about, really. But I would say that if I go back to those same people now, they probably would understand what I mean by that now, in terms of the emotional piece and making sure you're compatible with someone on an emotional level or spiritual level or any other level that you could think of that would help kind of lay the foundation for an intimate relationship.
Considering intimacy and these different kinds, can we spend a little bit of time there, just with you kind of providing us some education around these different kinds of intimacy, how we clinically should be thinking about them, and how we recognize them or label them in therapy?
Yeah. So I'll start with the obvious one, which is physical intimacy. And that's kind of the easy one that everyone knows about, which is around how it is that you connect with someone with your physical body, whether that be through touch, the sort of sensations. If we think about the five senses, um, how can we connect to those the five senses with ourselves and then kind of with someone else, right? And this isn't just like romantic relationships. If you think about it, we start doing this with babies, right? Our thing is to connect with these babies so we can build an intimate connection with them on a physical level. I mean, they listen to our heartbeats, they listen to they feel the heat and the warmth that we give them as mother and father. So it's so deep, but people don't typically think about it like that, because intimacy is more than just kind of, like I said, this physical aspect of things. It has so many different layers, but what we know first is the physical aspect. And I think the next piece is the psychological piece, which is kind of your thoughts and your feelings. And kind of like your personality traits, like, do you connect on those, the character piece of these things? So for example, are you someone who, if we think about psychologically, are you someone who likes open experiences? Are you someone who is very liberal versus very conservative? Like whatever those kind of attitudes about certain aspects of life are, thinking about it in that way. Emotionally, that's around your support, that's around empathy, that's around how you connect with people, how vulnerable you can be. If we go to the realm of spirituality, that is in the spirit world, whether it be religion or kind of your belief about a higher power, who you can or what it is, what being you connect to or not. Those are pieces that folks don't necessarily think to, but during times when it's important or when people are having trying times, they do typically, a lot of people will connect to something or not. And it's equally important to understand what those pieces are. And then social connection is something we typically don't talk about, but it's like, what are like, how do you connect with your friends? How do you connect with your family? What are those? Is it like very surface level connections? Are they things that you speak about or connect with on just kind of, hey, let's go out and have, some, beers or something, right? Or is it, let's go out in nature? Or is it a combination of both? What do you enjoy in that realm? And then financial is about, how do you think about finances? How did you grow up thinking about finances? And I think all of these have levels. There's very surface levels to every single one of these. And then there's kind of deeper, more latent levels about like really how we grew up thinking about these things and how that impacts how we show up in the world and how we're able to connect in partnership with all types of beings. And so if we're thinking about as a therapist, like I think it's important to help clients to understand where they're at on each of those different spectrums so that they can understand where the breakdown is, if at all, in their intimate relationships, whether it be with their partners, whether it be with, their siblings, whether it be with their mother, their father, whomever their friends, whomever they're in relationship with. It's really important to understand like why those breakdowns are happening. And a lot of times it has something to do with one of those things and being able to connect with them or not, or a lack of connection in that.
These different factors that you just named are so systemic. The examples that we're pulling from primary attachment figures, and my brain goes into attachment theory. And then, like, as soon as you said social connection, it's like I think all of us underestimated just how powerful social connection was until lockdowns of 2020.
Yes, this is so true. This is very true.
So kind of these factors that are impacting this, that are external, that are around us, instead of just the things that are happening within us, in terms of how outgoing we are. Are we highly sensitive and our nervous system gets more overwhelmed than someone who's not, let's say. But to consider kind of the balance of all of these factors creating either, I'm curious what your language is, but like fractured intimacy versus healthy intimacy.
Yeah, I would say, you can call, everyone's going to call it all sorts of things, but I would say, fractured. You can say ruptured. You can say just non-intimacy, period, right? That's something that also can happen. But yeah, I think that when we get put in these social situations, either by force, right, like COVID, or not, my hope is that people take a look at what it is that they value and what's important to them when there are these ruptures in those relationships. Because ultimately that is what ends up happening, is when these ruptures happen, something happens within us as a human being that realizes that this might not be the relationship for me, or maybe the way I'm going about this relationship is not the best for me or that person. And the only way we're going to know that is if we know what we value and what our boundaries are, and when those things are being crossed. And we, I think, as humans, generally speaking, underestimate the impact that crossing those boundaries has on us on a physiological level. Because we know when someone's in our space and it just doesn't seem right. We kind of get that little icky feeling, or we've been in situations where we don't feel comfortable. And historically, particularly those socialized as women, have been it's been suggested that we kind of push through and kind of ignore what is happening to us physiologically. But those are ways that we become more intimate with ourselves to understand what boundaries are being pushed, what boundaries do we actually have, and what we can do to enforce those boundaries with certain people and with ourselves.
This piece of socialization, I assume, is going to keep coming up. When you had given the example about emotional intimacy, the way that our culture, that we socialize men, boys around intimacy, it is so common that people socialized as males in our culture feel that kind of lone wolf pressure. If I have relationships, then I am weak. I don't know if I want to tell my friends about that illness or that thing, or that conflict that I'm having with work or with a partner or whatever it is. And I guess I'm kind of seeing it through a trickle down lens, that if we start with these norms that we're handing to children around, this is how you should behave, how difficult then it becomes to establish more emotional intimacy, to establish more physical intimacy with others and with yourself, just based on the social conditioning.
Agreed. And what we're also noticing is that there is or at least maybe it's because of what I put myself around and the energy that I want to be around and kind of where my selective attention goes to. But I've seen a movement towards men getting together, focusing on how they can become more vulnerable, how they can become more connected to themselves on an emotional level. Because I think they're starting to realize the deep impact that it can have on not just themselves, but on the relationships around them and the importance of those relationships, and people pulling away from them because of lack of emotional kind of emotional awareness. And so I think it's really important for, particularly, I mean, everybody really, like your level of emotional intelligence and how to connect with who you are and feeling understood and empathy and those things go a really, really long way. And there's been generations of people, not just men, but people who don't understand the impact of emotional disconnection and how that shows up in all sorts of types of relationships. Um, and so, unfortunately, I think that it can have a detrimental impact on people long term. And I'm starting to see it turn a corner where men are, those socialized as men, are starting to become more accepting of themselves as intimate beings, although it's kind of like an uphill battle, right? And so I don't know. My hope is that ultimately, you know, that could change. And then we would have less like suicidality, less alcohol, less kind of maladaptive coping strategies in order to deal with the lack of emotional intimacy or support. Because oftentimes men will say, I don't feel supported. And one of the things and arguments that I've had, because I've heard this over and over again, is you can't be supported if you don't recognize that you need support and aren't willing to say, I need support, right? So there was a study recently done that was talking about why why women live longer than men. And one of the reasons that they talked about was the fact that women live in community most of the times and men don't. They live in isolation. So if they're going through something, if they have some sort of terminal diagnosis or any diagnosis for that matter, they don't want people to know. It becomes the secret. But yet now you're literally suffering in silence and you don't have people around you who you can connect with, who you can let these feelings out for. And therapy is expensive. So people aren't able to, especially now, given all the stuff that's happening economically in our country, um, you know, being able to seek that level of help is hard and is already a problem for those socialized as men to kind of go out and seek that. So then to add on top of that, this inability to basically be vulnerable, which is truthfully where all the change happens.
There's so much here, like there's so many rabbit holes I want to go down in what you're saying, and the importance of that socialization factor. You had said a little bit ago about the way that people, particularly people who have been marginalized, struggle with boundaries, with recognition of even like what they're feeling and what's going on physiologically. That to me is potentially adaptive dissociation. You know, in order for me to navigate in this world, I need to push that down. But I've heard it said so many times in the substance use community, you can't selectively numb.
Mm.
So, how does intimacy come into play when we are, or I guess, how is intimacy affected when we disconnect from ourselves?
It's affected because it's not there, right? So you're the only person that can truly and honestly know who you are and what your wants are, what your needs are, what your desires are, and how you want to show up in the world. And in order to be able to live, this is my belief, in order for you to be able to live a truly fulfilled and sustainable life, it's really important for you to be aware of all of the things you just mentioned, right? So all of the emotions that you have, and really confront them head on, to be honest, because that's where the growth happens. And the growth happens in spaces where we don't want to delve. The growth happens in spaces where we don't want to be intimate with ourselves because we all live with some sort of demons that we've had, or childhood experiences, or some sort of traumas or triggers, or literally all the things that you can think of that have impacted us in a way that shows up in our relationships, right? And so if we are unable to be aware of those things, they're going to come out because subconsciously they're there. And so they're going to likely come out in maladaptive ways. And maybe it's not immediately, maybe it'll take some time, but ultimately it's going to come up in the roles that you play. It's going to come up in your relationship with your children. It's going to come up in your relationship with your spouse or your partner. They're going to come up in work environments. And so it makes sense for, people to stop and pause and become as self-aware as they can around the pieces of them that, now the language is the shadows of them, right? The pieces of them that have not necessarily, they don't want to see, but they're pieces of them or pieces of us, I should say, that have pushed us to where we are and have allowed us to get to a lot of places that we are. But at the same time, there's also good and bad to that. There's a yin and a yang to it. And so being able to understand what those pieces are, both how they've helped you adaptively and how they've impeded your progress and kind of where you are right now and what you can do to kind of move yourself forward from those hurt places is really important. And you can only do that through awareness, and not just awareness, because it's one thing to be aware of something, but also to say to yourself, like, I had this experience and that's okay. So there's this level of compassion that comes with that, and self-compassion, that's just letting you know that this experience, whatever it may have been, either I will grow from it, I will learn from it, or it served a purpose. Or maybe I haven't figured out what the purpose it served is yet, and that's okay. Just being able to sit with it in a compassionate way, in a non-judgmental way. I think that's important because oftentimes, so many of us struggle with self-worth already. And so if we start thinking about all the negative things that have happened to us and the shadows and all the triggers and the trauma, we run the risk of going down the rabbit hole of, not understanding not valuing those experiences for what they are, and being judgmental about where we are at in life right now.
So not taking into consideration enough of the context for why we do what we do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thinking about this idea that we so often default toward intimacy as sexual, I'm thinking about how, childhood, infancy, our first relationships being with our primary caregivers, and then that morphing through childhood into relationship with siblings, with peers, with teachers, things like that. And then that preteen, the notorious preteen years where stuff starts to get more complicated. And having worked quite a bit with preteens and teens in my career, and also having been nice and angsty, I didn't know what the book was. I didn't have a copy of that book to tell me how to navigate friendships and how to navigate my first crush and first kiss, and do you talk about it, do you not, like what are the norms and all these ideas. And that those like opportunities, those moments are really the foundations for us testing the waters, and probably also where the stakes feel really high, and also where we are learning things that, number one, may not be healthy, and number two, may not even be true, but because they were in isolated situations, we go, oh, this is how people behave. This is what's expected of me, or this is what I expect of somebody else. And these are, like, we kind of make this, guidebook in our minds. It's like, moving forward, if I encounter a person like this, this is what that means. And so we start to kind of break things down into little schemas as we navigate the world. If we're working with adults in not even reestablishing intimacy, but even establishing intimacy, do you feel like part of the work clinically is starting to identify and deconstruct, like, where are these belief systems that have kept you safe, but maybe also keeping you from developing healthy intimacy, not just sexually, but at all?
Yeah. So, wow. Yes. All of what you just mentioned is right on. So I, also happen to be trained as a sex coach. And when I went into this sex coaching thing, I thought, oh, wow, I get to learn about all these physical things and help people, because it's always been very interesting to me. And it was a year long training. And I'm going to say maybe 2 modules had to do with the physical aspect of things. Everything else was about navigating our physiological responses, understanding our values, understanding boundaries, and navigating our inner child and what we experienced as either children or teenagers in terms of how that relates to how we show up in relationships as adults. And so, what you will find is that if there is a connection between me understanding or someone helping you to understand what your childhood, wounds or triggers are, or what your inner child struggled with, and what you want in the bedroom, which sounds kind of crazy, right? So, um, like for example, and I can just speak to kind of my experience, right? So for me, without trying not to put anybody else on blast, right? So I'll just put myself out there, right? So for me, what was really important was security. And I was parentified a lot as a kid and adultified a lot as a kid. So for me, what's important to me in a physical aspect is I don't want to have control. I don't want anything to do with that. I want someone to lead. I want someone to be able to take that so that I don't have to do that. And that comes directly from me having to play that role as a kid so much, right? And so it's either we either want that role played or whatever that is that we did, or we want the complete opposite. Usually it's one or the two. And so really understanding what it is that your kind of core desires are, what is it, how it is that you want to be talked to, how is it that you want to interact. And it's not just sexually, right? It is, once again, what is it that you were missing as a child or as an adolescent that made you feel safe? And can you begin to cultivate that within yourself, number one, but then also helping other people to understand how to interact with you. And you're not going to be able to do that. And they're always going to miss the mark if you don't know that about yourself. And so as clinicians, right? So let me bring it back full circle, right? So as clinicians, I feel like it's our job to help clients to understand those aspects of themselves. Like, what is it that you felt like you needed? What is it that you wanted? How is it that you wished someone would talk to you or interact with you? And those are going to be the hallmarks and the staples of your partnerships moving forward, or your relationships with your own children, or other people in your life, is being able to check those boxes to say, yes, I need someone who is going to speak to me in a very kind and loving way because I didn't get that as a kid. Or I need someone who's going to have boundaries because I had these permissive parents where it was all over the place and I felt like I was like wandering all over, right? So it just really depends on on the individual, but helping them to explore those aspects of themselves so they can understand, once again, how can I show up and how can I help my partner love me in the ways that I need to be loved. And you won't be able to do that unless you know what your boundaries are, and you know what you value, and you know what are the things that make you tick.
Sounds so simple. And is so complicated because that early conditioning, the way I've likened it to clients, for good or for ill, is that it's like learning to make a kind of cake. And that was a way that your family made it. And then you may taste it someplace else and go, that's what's supposed to taste like? Like, because in your family there wasn't enough sugar, or it's like you substituted salt for sugar, or whatever it was, that it's like we become acclimated to what we were exposed to. And it also becomes very familiar. And then I can see that battle between what we are accustomed to and familiar with, and also what may actually be healthier for us, but may have, what I was thinking when you were talking was like a lot of shame associated with it. So the example of someone that really wants to have somebody kind of step in and take control. And I don't want to have to be the adult in the room all the time. I want somebody to nurture me. I can absolutely see a client saying, but I shouldn't want that.
Yes. Right. And one of the things, and I have to work on this with myself as well, but one of the things that I try and work with clients on are taking that word should out, right? Because whether or not you quote unquote should or shouldn't want X, whatever that thing is, that's what your desires are. That's what your needs are. And so, how about meet yourself where in what you want? That there's power in that. And so, and also bringing a normative kind of side to whatever it is that they're experiencing, right? Because a lot of people will say, like I know, I've worked with a client before who was sexually abused, and they like that abuse. Meaning, by like, I don't mean like they liked it at the time. What I'm saying is, in the bedroom, that's what they want, and there's so much shame associated with that. And I'm like, no, uh, one, there are a lot of people out there where that's a thing, right? And if that's your thing, then own it. That's your thing. That's what brings you pleasure. That's what makes you happy. And that's okay. And so getting people to that point, though, is all about deshamifying and showing them that, you know, it's okay to have those types of desires and wants, and they're welcome. And you just have to find someone who's willing and able to meet you where you are. But once again, that comes with self-awareness. If you're not aware of that, then being able to communicate that to a partner, your partner may not be into that sort of thing. And so that might be a mismatch. Or you might have a compassionate, kind of empathetic partner who's like, hey, I love you and I'm willing to work with that. Show me how. Show me what you need, and I can meet you there.
I sincerely appreciate that you just brought up the mismatch point, because that was exactly what I was thinking about, the potential echoes of a person who is in intimate relationships, and not necessarily sexual, but as we change, as we have these epiphanies, we get more in touch with ourselves, we appreciate what we want, we need friends who are more communicative, less communicative, we need sexual relationships where we have more power, less power, whatever it is. That's happening. And then it's radiating out into our outside relationships that may or may not be able to accommodate to the change that's happened within us.
I mean, you said so much in that. And, um, you know, even if we take this outside, like you said, outside of the bedroom and outside of kind of physical intimacy, I feel like our job as humans is to grow and to mature, and to one day at a time understand ourselves better and better and better, so that one, we can show up for ourselves, but two, we can also show people how to show up for us. And I say that because you can always, as the saying goes, lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So I can show you and tell you and show up for you, and tell you all the things that I need to show up. But then we have the decision that we have to make about whether or not our partner is meeting our standards, if you will. And so my hope is that if you're in a loving relationship where things are reciprocal and you're someone of sound mind, right, then you'd be able to meet that person where they are. And if not, realize that and pivot in terms of what makes the most sense for you.
That mismatch, I've seen it play out, and that can end up with discernment counseling and conversations about, like, does this relationship still serve me? Because I think so many of us, for various reasons, from various backgrounds, are disconnected from ourselves. And the limitation being there, that if we don't have that sound relationship with ourselves, with what we really want, how can we realistically communicate that effectively to a partner if we haven't even identified it? And then we go through these different stages of life. Eric Erickson is like, this one's next, like,
Yeah.
like, this
Right.
is this is what we do, and we're industrious here, and all of these things. But as we change in that, how do we change together? How do we change apart? And that's a big thing to talk about in therapy. On this topic of intimacy with self, I've heard it said for therapists that we can only take a client as far as we have gone.
Agreed. 100%.
Can you speak to that a little bit? Because a lot of these topics, let's just take sex. So sexual intimacy, this is loaded. This is loaded in many cultures, particularly in ours. What kind of environment were we raised in? Like, there were words that I was not allowed to say. And I'm sure if I still said them to this day, one of my parents would be like, what? and these are not like 4-letter words. These are just
Mm-hmm.
words.
Right.
So then how is that playing out for me as a practitioner in therapy?
Yeah, I listen, what you're I feel like you're preaching right now because it's true, right? It is so first and foremost, I think as human beings evolve, period. And so in terms of that evolution, right? If you outgrow particularly a therapist, the beauty is you can go see a new one, right? And so how you're able to determine whether or not you've kind of outgrown a therapist or someone has outgrown your level of expertise, that I think is where self awareness comes in as a therapist to say, listen, I can't, I don't feel comfortable with the topics that kind of we're talking about. And I think you deserve way more than I can offer you right now. And once again, I think that that involves us as therapists knowing what our level of self awareness is. So I think about people who have come to me in terms of this sexual coaching space, and they're talking about you know open relationships and that sort of thing, non-judgment at all. Like I have no judgment on that. If that works for you and you can figure out how to make those boundaries work, by all means, go for it, right? At the same time, that's not something I specialize in. So I do have people that do. So, I would refer them to that. But that, once again, speaks to my level of awareness and being able to say, hey, this is outside of my realm. This is not something that I feel like I can help you kind of move forward in. And if that is the case, then it's my responsibility. I have an ethical duty to you to say, hey, I can no longer take you any further. I think as therapists, also where we fall short is, like you said, around our level of awareness um, and feeling like it's our job to do kind of all things and being able to provide people with insight around something we haven't or we don't. And I think that's where the ruptures come in relationships and client therapist relationships, is when there's a rub in the road of I want to be this, I want to have this level of intimacy or level of vulnerability with my therapist because I feel like this is where we want to go. And the therapist being like, nope, I'm the stoic person who was taught this in my client therapy relationship. And for that reason, I cannot go beyond this ethical boundary. And that's fine for you to acknowledge. At the same time, recognizing and putting that forth and letting people know it's about open communication. And so I think a lot of times that's where the disconnect happens, is when therapists show up in one mind and then clients show up in another mind. And then those things are not talked about because we're taught not to disclose and we're taught not to be vulnerable with our clients, et cetera, et cetera.
When client and therapist alike, just humans, all of us humans, when we struggle with intimacy, you had already mentioned, one study about women living longer and them believing that one of the reasons is because women are socialized to be in community more. What are the consequences of human beings not having intimacy?
The consequences of humans not having intimacy are there will always feel like a lack of connection and or belonging. There will be feeling as though they are misunderstood. They'll be feeling as though they might have some, either way, either party might have like some self-worth issues. So the consequences are really severe ultimately, because it's kind of like, as human beings, we thrive on belongingness. I mean, unless you have like a mental health disorder, which we know about some of those mental health disorders where, people don't want that, right? They don't want to connect with individuals, and that's fair, right? But generally speaking, most people want to connect with people. And if they're not able to do that, then, and they want to be seen, like most people want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be understood. And so if you're not willing to be vulnerable, then you're not going to be seen, you're not going to be heard, and you're not going to be understood. If you're constantly someone who has your guard up, whether you be a therapist or a client, that's going to be the case. And you're just not going to end up having the relationships that you want to have and feel supported in the way that you deserve to be supported. And it could be scary for some people because one of the caveats that I do want to say about this is safety is important. And so this is not to say that, oh, just because I met someone, now I need to be this vulnerable being in order to connect with them. No, there's time that goes into understanding people and you being able to connect with them and kind of titrate, if you will, that level of intimate connection with them based on reciprocation.
I appreciate you bringing up that point. I remember seeing a study a number of years ago about friendship, and basically what makes friendship. How many times do you have to have seen somebody to go from acquaintance into friend? And these are really interesting ideas. And I was comforted in this study because it wasn't one or two times. It wasn't like, oh, I've seen you at the school picnic twice. Like, we're friends now. It's like maybe you have like a mutual like for each other, or you have hobbies and comments or whatever, but like the actual intimacy that is built over multiple times seeing each other. And I want to say the study was 6 to 8 times to even kind of cross over into real like friendship and understanding what that was. But I think it's that normalizes maybe some of our hesitation of like, no, it's okay to go slow. And then on the flip side, there is the overshare. It's like, I'm going to rush into intimacy. Here's all of my stuff. Show me all of yours, or we besties forever. And that kind of delicate balance in finding healthy intimacy that is neither too fast nor too slow and discerning. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that is perfectly said. I think the way that I look at that is as you begin to build relationship with people and understand them, people will share things about themselves little by little. And you get to choose whether or not you want to reciprocate those sharing little by little. And then you get to see, well, what happens when I share, right? The other thing you get to see, which I think is an amazing dynamic, is if you're around them and you're around their friends, then you get to see what it is that they share about themselves and what it is that they share about other people. So the longer you share with people, then in the longer, more interactions you have with them, you get to really see how they show up for other people as well. And then as a discerning individual, you can say, if this is your best friend and I hear you talking about your best friend in this way, is that a friendship I want to be part of? Right. And so that longevity in those relationships allows you to be able to see, how do people show up, not just for me, but for one another?
I appreciate the point you just made. The quote that popped into my mind was Maya Angelou: when people tell you who they are, believe them.
That is, I say that all the time. Yes. Yeah. Because you get to see, is this person gossipy about other things and people, and to what level are they gossiping?
Yeah.
To some degree, most people talk about other people, right? But it's about, to me, it's about that level of talking about and what is being shared and how it's being shared. Is it like an insightful share? Is it a like, let's kind of commiserate, you're not alone share? You know what I mean? So it really depends on the type of share, I think. And then you get to decide what type of share you want to be involved in, because you get to see how are they behaving.
And then the assumption that if that's happening over there, then with some probability it could happen to me too. And is that acceptable?
Mm-hmm. Is that within my value system? Is that something that, yeah.
So that was going to be my next question around values. How do you help clients uncover what some of their values around intimacy are, both sexual and non-sexual?
The way it's just, I think it's about asking them pertinent questions. Like, what are the top things that are most important to you in a friendship? What are the top things that are most important to you in your sibling relationship? What are the top things that are most important for you in your child's like your relationship with your child? Then you get to see, once you figure those out, you get to look and say, are there some common denominators here? And then that is how you kind of begin to evaluate, I want to say, your value system. If you notice that If you notice that something like, I'm just going to make something up, safety is important. You want your child to feel safe, you want to feel safe, and you want your partner to feel safe, and you want to feel safe. Then that's something that's a hallmark and it's a value of yours. And if we think about that in terms of like sexuality and kind of sexual development, you want to be understanding what safety means for that person. Is that something like consent? And what does that consent look like? Is that like moving consent, like I'll just progress, and then you tell me no? Or is that, let me ask you every step of the way? Or is that annoying to you? Like you get to see what that level of consent looks like and kind of how that relates to your level of safety. Safety can also mean like, okay, are we on the same page about like getting tested for STIs? Right? Like that to me is important. That makes me feel safe. Me sharing something with you that's really intimate in terms of my emotional well being or whatever it is. If I share that with you, how do you hold space for that? That's important to me. That's a safety thing, right? So once you begin to uncover kind of these different aspects of what people's values are, and by asking them questions like what's important to them, then you can help them to build a value system. And then once you build that value system, the cool thing is like it's your job as an individual to, you then know what's important to you. And it kind of makes it kind of makes moving in your world very easy. It's like, I know that safety is important. So if you're out here being reckless in terms of your sexuality, and how you show up in terms of high risk sexual behavior, whatever you decide that is, then maybe that's not for me. That's outside of my value system, right? So it just really depends. What does trust mean for you? There's so many aspects to trust. Like, like I said, I'm in this. I've worked in this group before, and there's where we talk about everything related to trust. One of the things is infidelity. Okay, great. So if you're someone who has experienced that, what is it that you're willing to do to demonstrate that you can gain someone else's trust? And that spans across not just sexual, emotional intimacy, right? Or infidelity or betrayal. That's like a financial thing, that's a spiritual thing. Like you can just look at that and it can go across all different aspects of things. When it comes to finances, are you open and transparent about where you're at financially? Can we have conversations? Or do I notice that on the side, you're doing some things that I do not see as trustworthy? Right. And so you get to peer into people's experiences based on what your value system is, and you communicating, because your level of trust and how you define trust may be very different than how I define trust. And I think that's really important to talk about and make sure everyone's on the same page around what those values are and what they mean to people. So you can label them, but what does it really mean?
I can also hear the importance of clinicians being comfortable going into those conversations, because I would imagine that some of the first times that someone has ever even considered having these conversations or had them at all may be in the context of a clinical relationship. So are we okay saying those words? Are we okay doing, having a role play conversation about asking to have your needs met, whether that's around taking out the trash or that's around what kind of touch sexually feels good. I think because we have all clinicians, we have our glasses on that we look through the world with. And I appreciate what you said earlier about kind of knowing where ours are, so that it's not limiting the therapeutic work, that we're not taking an opportunity away from a client to have a safe experience exploring things that they may not have been able to elsewhere when it comes to any kind of intimacy, whether that's talking about money or talking about sex or talking about when you use these words or you talk to me with this raised tone, it reminds me of this thing that happened. And I don't really like that. But I think that it's one of those kind of clinical pressures of can we hold the frame for things that we may be uncomfortable with, and how do we clinically get more comfortable with them?
And like you said, I think it's very, really important to consider, because I mean, as clinicians, I liken it to being pastors, right? We're just humans. we make mistakes, we show up in the world, but yet we have this pulpit, we have this client chair, we have this, or Zoom now, um, where we're seemingly have it all together, and that's not necessarily the case. And so, that idea of transference and kind of our stuff coming into our therapeutic realm is really, really important. And so being able to say, like, this is something that I've dealt with personally, and it's a little touchy for me. And for this reason, like, I might have to do some consultation on this, or just kind of, I need some time to sit with this personally because of X, Y, and Z. And once again, to me, that's a level of vulnerability that we typically don't get taught as clinicians, and being able to sit with that. But that's what builds the intimacy, even within our relationships with our clients. Because, I can say that, I've been to several therapists, and the ones that I've jived with, the ones that I connected with the most, have been people who have been, and I feel like have shown up as their authentic self, versus me just going in and then being really robotic and, as we talked about before the show, like manualized, and, like, this is our next session, this is exactly what we need to talk about in order to get rid of your depression. Maybe that's not what I'm dealing with for today, right? So being able to be mentally flexible in that sense, and just coming forth in the therapeutic relationship around being forthright about where you're at, what you're experiencing, and if you're not ready to deal with that, being able to say, "Hey, I'm not ready to deal with this," or I don't think I'm best suited to match your needs right now.
Therein lies also the power of modeling.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to say, this is outside of my boundaries, this is outside of my values, or whatever it is, not with judgment, being mindful of how the power dynamic is affecting a client potentially feeling shame, but that assertiveness to thine own self be true clinically. You've mentioned these different kinds of intimacy and the ideas around helping clients recognize what their values are, going through different kinds of scenarios, asking different questions, uncovering where their boundaries are, maybe where they'd like them to be different. What are the most helpful resources that you've gleaned over time to help clinicians get better at this in having conversations about intimacy and values and boundaries?
Several resources. One, I think that if any clinician really wants to take their practice to a different level, having someone or having their own clinician who is more of like who specialize in kind of like somatic experiences, I think that that's important. Understanding their body and how to connect their body to the emotions that they are having. Because when we are in sessions, just like everybody else, we have a physiological response to what our clients are saying as well. And so understanding and being able to bounce back or pivot depending on what that response is, or being able to lean into it if you're able to lean into it without creating kind of a rupture. So I think somatic training, I think, is important. Any sort of training around inner child work and shadow work, I think, would be really important. In addition to that, leaning into understanding more, especially around couples. Like if you're working with couples, being able to work around experiential dynamics is important. And what I mean by that is come into the session, let them experience something, and then you figure out as a clinician and understand where to insert yourself and help them balance how to be more respectful, how to come at the conversation, how to actually be more vulnerable. I think that's pieces of vulnerability that needs to be modeled, that clients don't get and couples don't get to see. Like, what is that, an empathetic response? Maybe not, right? And so being able to understand and help them from a third party to figure out what that piece is. One of the best resources that I've used, and this is from my sex training, which was Making Love Real. It's by Celeste Hirschman and Danielle Harrell. And then they also have a book called Coming Together, both very fascinating books around intimacy and how to cultivate that, and how to just be in relationship. So I think those are two of the ones that I would rank.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Intimacy is something that I think we all struggle with. And I think it's such a critical component of being a human being. And I appreciate you coming on today to shed some more light on this topic and just even just normalize how tough it can be to be intimate as a person and then also as a therapist to lean into what may be really uncomfortable conversations.
It's really, really hard. So, and I appreciate you for even entertaining the conversation because it's hard. It's hard. Vulnerability is hard. And that's all intimacy is about. And I mean, if you look up the definition of vulnerability, it's like basically like protecting yourself. And so the idea is that we want to protect ourselves. And so if we show that aspect of us, we can be protected, but we have to be able to put ourselves out there in order for someone else to demonstrate that to ourselves. So
thank you so much, Dr. Tamora. Again, for our listeners, we have Dr. Tamora Callands here. And Dr. Tamora, for our listeners who are wanting to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way to do that?
yeah, so the best way to do that is one, which is kind of cool. I created a sexual quiz, a sexual desires quiz. That's at drtamoracallands.com. So it's just my name, Dr. Tamora Callands, CALLANDS.com. It's kind of fun. It's very spicy. It's cool. It helps you to understand what your core desires as a sexual being are. And then in the near future, which I don't have out right now, I'm going to be doing some challenges and some other things to help people become more sexually or intimately connected with themselves as a whole, not just on a sexual level. So
fantastic. Thank you again for joining us. This has been a really lovely conversation and so helpful to help us get better at this.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.